Energy Transition, episode 28. The topic today is Sanctions and Dissimulations. Good morning, Irene Slav and David Blackmon.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Please let me show some data about Venezuela. As an example only, please. Let me share my screen. Can you see the screen here?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. It's interesting to see that Venezuela from 1997 to 2020, the production came from 3 million barrels a day, a little bit more, to almost 700,000 barrels a day. So a decline, very strong decline, very huge one. And another point is important to say that the U.S. let any Repsol to ship Venezuela oil to Europe for that. And Venezuela said that they want to receive refined products from Italy and Spain in exchange of its crude. So, David, please let me put here a difficult game. No, David, what do you think about that?
Very difficult, very difficult. Yeah, Venezuela said on Friday, well, they cut off exports on Friday, halted exports to get the deal you talked about there. You know, they're no longer interested in trading crude for debt relief. And now they want refined products from Italy and Spain. Why? Because Venezuela's refining sector has been so decimated that it can no longer supply the population's diminishing needs for refined products. Let's face it, their economy has been in a situation of almost total collapse for 3 or 4 years now, due to the policies of the Maduro government and the irrational nationalization of the oil industry that he implemented a few years ago. Denying his country all of the international investment from oil companies in other countries that had, at one time, before Hugo Chavez took power, made Venezuela one of the major international oil powers on earth. And Venezuela, at least supposedly, theoretically, has more oil reserves in the ground than any country other than potentially the United States and maybe Saudi Arabia. And yet their total production, as you just showed, is around 700,000 barrels of oil per day. Some of that's due to U.S. sanctions. Most of it is not, though. Most of it's due to internal policies. And unfortunately, Europe was wanting to rely on those Venezuelan oil imports to help replace what they're losing due to the sanctions on Russia. So it's a really bad situation.
But David, another point, the oil that Venezuela has is heavy oil and very complicated to produce without technology and systems. And when the American companies left the country, the technology they do not have to make this production available.
Well, that's right. And unfortunately, one thing the Maduro government has done is really decimate the pool of talent available to the national oil company there, PDVSA. And, I was at Shell 15 years ago, and we had, during that time, partnerships, joint ventures in Venezuela with PDVSA. It was a wonderful group of people to deal with, very talented, really brilliant people. And unfortunately, most of them have, found other opportunities to pursue rather than work for the Maduro thugs. And this is a result. And it's just one of so many factors that have resulted in this undersupplied global market, where last month I saw a report this morning that said OPEC Plus had undershot its quotas by 2.9 million barrels of oil per day during July. So it's a terrible situation all around.
Yeah. Irina, please, sanctions and losses for all directions, no?
Yes, I have been saying, and I'm not the only one, that sanctions don't really seem to achieve the goals they set out to achieve. I mean, Maduro is still in power in Venezuela, and hardliners won the elections in Iran. And I would readily argue that if it weren't for sanctions, I'm not so sure about Venezuela, but in Iran, Iran was going on a reform path. You know, the previous president was a moderate, but when you've got sanctions by another country imposed on you, people tend to, you know, to get more
Dissimulate.
hardlined.
Dissimulate.
Yeah, and well, we're seeing the opposite of the desired effect. And as regards the situation with oil exports from Venezuela and from Iran, from any country really, Europe right now is in the position of, I'm sorry to say, a junkie. It's entirely at the mercy of its dealers, which means that the dealers can call the shots. Whatever the dealer says happens, because Europe has no leverage in this situation. And as we can see, Venezuela has taken advantage of the situation, asking for refined products because it needs refined products because of what David said. Its refining industry is in shambles. And it also needs, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, David, but they need fuels to dilute their heavy crude in order to make it exportable.
Right.
And even with US sanctions on Venezuela, Venezuela can get its way now.
While you're doing that, I would just, also point out that the sanctions discussion that she was having there, it is really a terrible situation for Europe because Europe has no energy security because of their own decisions related to energy policy. They have no energy security whatsoever. As Irina said, no leverage in this situation with Venezuela. And the other country that they were hoping to lean on for additional imports of oil is Iran. And Iran can only do that if it ultimately reaches this nuclear deal with the United States and Russia and the other countries involved in that. And so the situation's become so desperate because of the sanctions they've put on Russia related to this war, that they're having to rely on two of the most unreliable countries on earth for this crude oil to come into their continent. But anyway, go ahead, Irina. We lost you there in the middle of your discussion.
Yes, and let me add in. Do you think that sanctions are effective? I mean, the results are good for the world and the countries that are applying the sanctions?
Well, I don't see this working. I mean, apart from the US making a point that it can curb or almost eliminate oil exports from certain countries. But the point was to choke the Maduro regime or the Iranian regime. This is not happening. Like I said, Maduro is still in power. The Iranian hardliners have come back to power. And neither Venezuela nor Iran are becoming more democratic countries. And their oil is still flowing abroad at much reduced rates.
Right.
And China is benefiting from the whole thing.
China's benefiting greatly. There was a really good story at Reuters over the week, or maybe it was Bloomberg, talking about the fact that China's imports from Russia were up another 8% in July, and it's 40% more than a year ago. And they're getting it all at a reduced price because Russia is offering reduced prices. And so, China's benefiting, India's benefiting. And meanwhile, who's suffering? The people in Europe are suffering.
And the people in Venezuela and the people in Iran.
Right.
The sanctions are not helping these people, yeah. And they're not achieving the goals they were set to achieve.
Right. And they almost never do. I mean, you look at the history of these kinds of sanctions, they almost never achieve their desired effect. But the United States government, sadly, continues to go down
to
that
do
road.
that. Yeah, Irina, and in the case of minerals and rare earths, I mean, China is dominating the process. Is it possible to have some kind of sanctions for them?
That would be really interesting to see. The U.S. leveling sanctions on China for whatever. I mean, I'm sure there are reasons good enough for the U.S. State Department to propose sanctions, but China has really cornered the market in rare earths processing, and not just rare earths processing. Lithium processing is again mostly done in China. So I really don't see this happening, which is why I think the US is threatening China with action, but is not taking any actual punitive action against
Right.
China, whatever China does. Because they know this will be the end of the world as we know it. And I don't mean an all-out war. I mean that China has really done its homework, and it's made itself indispensable for the transition that the current US government and European governments are so eager to take us on.
Well, and when you really think about it, Armando, when you look at the situation the United States is in related to these critical minerals, where China's concerned, it's exactly the same situation Europe was in with Russia on oil and natural gas before this war in Ukraine began. The United States government, the Biden administration, and the Democratic majorities in both houses of our Congress are focused on this energy transition and trying to subsidize it into existence with all this trillions of dollars in new debt spending. But to achieve it, they have to have plentiful supplies of all those energy minerals. Lithium being a prime example. I wrote about vanadium last week, antimony, cobalt, tungsten, copper, silver, aluminum, you name it. China dominates the market in it. And the supply chains all go through China virtually. And so the US doesn't have any leverage over China where these minerals are concerned. And that was a conscious choice our country made in the 1980s when we just decided, because of our social agenda, to stop mining for those minerals in the United States, stop approving new mines. So that's where we are. We have no energy security where they're concerned.
While you are talking, I put in the screen the quantity of minerals that are processed, and it's impressive how they dominate these things.
And it wasn't just the United States that made that decision. It was Europe as well, Canada. The whole developed Western world made that decision in the 1980s that China wants to dominate that market, and we're going to let them do it because it's a lot cheaper to source those minerals through that supply chain.
If we could count the number of countries that has sanctions among countries, how many of them we have? How many countries have sanctions? More than, I don't know.
What a great question. I'm going to have to research that. I don't know, Irina. Do you?
Well, if we're talking about oil sanctions, well, Venezuela, Iran, and Russia, it's plenty, I think.
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
I mean, those are the only ones I'm aware of on crude oil. But on other things, the United States and through the UN as well, there are a lot of sanction regimes happening, and I'm gonna research. I'll have that answer next week.
Yeah, good, excellent. Okay, people, was a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Y'all have a great week.
You too. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.